Speaking of admitting when you're wrong and transparent integrity, let's talk about RFK Jr. And see what kind of reporting challenge he presents. So these are the scenarios that I ran by Dr. Ballou, and I think in some ways it was a little bit unfair because they're all really, really difficult. And so let's see how we do with these. I mean, we know.
If I can pause you just for a second, Matthew, I just wanted to say that this is very similar to what happened when I talked to Lee McIntyre. And when I said, hey, let's do a lightning round, and I ran these different things by him, and she had a similar response, which I think is a kind of academic humility, where people don't just give confident slapshot opinions. They're like, that's interesting. That's complicated. I would need to know more. It could be this or it could be that. So I'm not going to say for sure, right?
It's true. And it also, I mean, to be fair, it indicates the difference between, academic work and on the ground reporting where, there's an intense amount of information to take in at any given time, and narratives and ways of telling stories and, terms used are all sort of concretized way faster than anybody can keep track of. And so the sort of on the ground, like, okay, well, how would you apply this? That's its own skill, right? Yeah. And it doesn't, and there's not a lot of time to learn it in. So I understand. I mean, I proposed these because I struggle with them. So looking at RFK, I mean, we know this guy is disinformation dozen captain. He's probably the political sort of heart of the disinformation dozen in terms of his legacy and his connections. We know that he is courting Black communities and leaders who have their own good historical reasons for their distrust in government and institutions and so on. What do we have to keep in mind in order to report on this guy, and how do we do it? How do we explain that he's manipulating marginalized populations without adding more stigma to the mix?
The first thing I would look at when looking at what he's done, specifically moving into and targeting Black communities to spread his propaganda, I would point to a previous example, which happened in the Somali American community in 2017 in Minnesota. Andrew Wakefield had been courting that community for almost a decade at that time, and it led to a measles outbreak because of his anti-vax messaging. And I pulled a piece from Vox that was reporting during that period, which explains it. Minnesota's 2017 measles outbreak is a case in point. In 2008, anti-vaccine advocates, including the Organic Consumers Association and Andrew Wakefield, a British doctor who falsified data suggesting vaccines are linked to autism, began targeting local Somali Americans who had concerns about autism among their children. The activists saw an opening, offering an explanation when the health department couldn't provide one. This is even looking what you just said a moment ago about academics. They're going to weigh the evidence. But when you have these charismatic charlatans who just have an activist message they want to get across, they don't have to wait for explanations. They just pounce. And it's important to remember in context that the WHO said that the measles were eradicated in America in the year 2000. So yeah, there was only 79 cases in Minnesota among that community. I think 62 were Somali Americans, so something like 80% were specific to that community. So it doesn't appear like a large number, but the suffering those families and the children had to go through is purely because of the anti-vax propaganda, and RFK is using the same playbook.
I just wanted to point out that a line in the Vox report, like the activists saw an opening offering an explanation when the health department couldn't provide one, like it just raises all kinds of questions for me about the diagnostic procedures for these kids. How was neuroatypicality in the Somali American population of that city? How was it understood? Were there other sort of factors involved? Were there, language issues? Like it raises all kinds of questions about not only, the health department not potentially providing good services, but the public education system, there's a deep story there. I'm sure it's much more richly reported than the Vox article. So I'm actually interested in that. I want to check that out.
Part of what you're seeing there is that people like Kennedy and Wakefield, they're actually going to go out into those communities and actively solicit and engage and create events and, be walking down the street and have megaphones and all the rest of what they do in a way that, public health officials don't have time, or, it's not really their style.
And another connection here is that Wakefield's autism vaccine connection hinged upon thimerosal, which was taken out of almost all vaccines the year after his falsified study came out. And RFK Jr. still talks about thimerosal, even though it's in almost no vaccines. So he knows he's being egregious when he goes into these communities and makes that connection, because it doesn't exist in the MMR vaccine anymore.
You're saying Kennedy doesn't stay true to the facts. It's very, very interesting. Yeah, and I want to add there too that thimerosal was taken out not because of any negative impacts, but because of the fear mongering and all of the parents thinking that, oh my God, this is terrible.
Yes.
We took out the thing that didn't actually have an impact, and I hope you're happy. But now you're saying that it's still there. Okay,
exactly.
right.
It's a little bit like the mask cock-up from last time that Lee McIntyre was critical of. I wanted to ask you, Matthew. You had said before that Kennedy was collaborating in some sense with Nation of Islam. Is that something you had seen?
Yeah, one or two of the thought leaders on a couple of the conferences that he did around his medical apartheid film were Nation of Islam people, right?
Yeah, and for me that's a really interesting one in terms of how we frame these sorts of things, because Nation of Islam is just an openly right-wing, fundamentalist, anti-Semitic, anti-LGBTQ. They're actually a black supremacist group. Kennedy collaborating with them really betrays any pretense toward progressive politics. And that's something that I feel should be pointed out and not just glossed over. Sure, they're associated with Black liberation in some way, but it's from a very, very religious fascist kind of point of view. But that aside, the manipulation of vulnerabilities that are rooted in marginalization and oppression in order to perpetuate science denial and misinformation about vaccines is something we should be able to name and critique openly, especially in light of the danger it pushes onto Black communities in the name of this kind of caricature of liberation and empowerment that people like Kennedy and perhaps Wakefield in that example are exploiting. I don't know, with regard to what you were saying, Derek, the tough part for me with these kinds of people is that I just wonder how much they really believe what they're saying, because I don't understand why Kennedy would do everything he does. It's not like he needs the money, and I don't see I can't follow the money to what he's getting out of it. Like why he would do this unless he really thought he was helping protect children.
I think the really important thing is, what does his uncle think now that he's back? That would be indicative.
I wasn't in Dealey Plaza, so I can't say for sure that he didn't appear on the grassy knoll and give communion to the faithful.
Just one note that I wanted to add, which is kind of like a today I learned. I don't really have anything to say about it, but what I didn't know about the Minnesota measles outbreak situation is that Ilhan Omar seems to have broken her teeth by pressing the state legislature at that time to fund more vaccine outreach. She put forward a motion that was actually voted down at the time. But to speak to the sort of ongoing politics of public health and the role of perhaps progressive Democrats in this whole story, that was pretty interesting.